I'm going to be referencing an article out of CTV News, and this, for you folks, in case you're not aware, the reason why I use these establishment media sources, well, it's kind of twofold. One, most of the time when you're talking about CBC, but even CTV to a lesser extent, or some of the other establishment media hacks, hey, I'm forced to bail them out or prop these people up or pay for them against my will, I'll add. So you're darn right, I'm going to use their articles, their rhetoric, or the propaganda, not just against them, but also as a record that I or anyone else who watches my videos can reference at any time for any reason in order to use the information that they espouse against them. That's the thing, folks. When you're using alternative media or fringe sources for your news and information, and trust me, I got nothing against that at all. Matter of fact, I pay attention to outlets such as those as well. The problem, of course, is the fact that people can just outright ignore or deny anything you have to say based solely on the source of where you're getting the information. Now, I get it. It shouldn't be that way. It should all rest and reside on the validity of the facts that they're reporting. But as we understand, most people trust the establishment institutions in our country and have been programmed or indoctrinated to believe that anyone that challenges the establishment or the status quo are just either far-right activists or tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists. So like I say, using their own information, their own media against them, and the fact that they once again reference so-called experts, that gives another layer of credibility for us to use this information against them. And trust me, you're going to want to not just watch this video, but take note of what's being said in this article and definitely use it against them at some point in time going forward. Headline, CTV News, no legal grounds for employers to force employees to get vaccinated, say experts. So not even just one expert, right? It's experts, multiple, which should, based on the way things are done around here these days, give you some credibility to push back or, once again, use this source to promote and solidify the whole concept of sovereignty, freedom, and individual choice. This is reported by Meredith McLeod, December 4th, 2020. Last updated December 7th, 2020. Toronto. As a potential COVID-19 vaccine gets closer to reality in Canada, so does the reality that as employees who have been working remotely return to their workplaces, there are uncharted legal and ethical waters ahead. Among the issues to be navigated, could employers force staff to get vaccinated? Really, really important question, right? I mean, without even having to read this article or reference anything from the established media or even any established politician or political party, I can tell you that, yeah, there is no such thing as, whether it's legal or moral authority, to force you to put something in your body against your will. That's just common sense, right? Or at least it should be for most thinking people. There's no legal precedent for that, say employment lawyers. What employers would like employees to do is quite a bit different, though, than what they can require employees to do. Amy Frankel, for Law in Langley, BC, told CTV Vancouver. Frankel says, given current principles and the state of Canadian law, it's safe to say employers probably at this point cannot mandate vaccinations as a condition of employment. An employer will not be permitted to make a COVID-19 vaccine mandatory as a condition of employment. Brock Ouellette, an employment lawyer with Samfuru Tumarkin in Ottawa, wrote in a blog. Although mandatory vaccination would not be permitted, many employers could strongly suggest that their employees get vaccinated for COVID-19 to decrease the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. Governments and public health officials at the federal and provincial levels have said that COVID-19 vaccine will be voluntary. We have no mandatory immunization programs in this country and in this province, and we do not expect COVID immunization will be mandatory either, said BC Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry during a news conference Wednesday. That's true even at high-risk workplaces like hospitals and long-term care facilities, Henry said. So let me repeat that again, folks, because she's even referencing, because that's the thing where the gray area, right, where some people are suggesting that you might have to as a terms of your employment if you deal with the aged and the elderly and people who are vulnerable, right? So even under those circumstances or situations, this Dr. Bonnie Henry, BC's top health official, right, an expert, right, is saying, no, not even under those circumstances. So once again, keep this in mind, folks. Because once again, if you're talking to someone out there and they're saying, well, they're referencing experts, well, you can push back against mandatory anything, in particular vaccines, and say, hey, you're referencing experts as well. We will be strongly encouraging everybody in those settings to be immunized. And if people are thinking of going into those settings and don't believe in immunization, then they should look for other things to do, she said. I mean, that's the thing. Without mandating anything, of course we should all practice common sense and being reasonable when you're going into these long-term care facilities where you do have a lot of people who are very, very vulnerable and susceptible to not just contacting COVID-19, but many other viruses, infections, or diseases as well. Yes, of course, but at the end of the day, it just requires common sense and reasonable policies that most people understand and can adhere to properly. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has vowed to change existing legislation in order to remove any possibility that could allow the province to impose vaccinations. So yeah, close up them loopholes. I would suggest that for any premier or anyone at any level of government is, yes, close up any loophole that may allow, even though we know it'll be hopefully or eventually overturned by the Supreme Court, but in the meantime, a lot of harm can take place. So yeah, close up those loopholes if you're in a position to do so. Schools do require children to be immunized against a number of infectious diseases, but there are exemptions for medical reasons or due to matters of conscience or religious beliefs. If an employer fired an employee who refused to get a COVID-19 vaccine for such a reason, it could amount to a human rights violation, argues Ouellette. Carrie Bowman, a bioethicist and a professor at the University of Toronto, says to make a vaccine mandatory is ethically problematic, especially with so many outstanding questions about risks and how much of the population needs to be vaccinated to eradicate the virus. Ethically, I'm not a believer in mandatory vaccines. To have something injected into your body that you don't want or don't believe is safe is not true informed consent. Beautifully said, well stated, and thank you for saying as such, Carrie Bowman. But private companies offering services to customers in congregate settings such as airlines, restaurants, and sports and entertainment venues can set their own rules and require proof of vaccination, said Bowman. Having the market forces take over is much different than having the state make it mandatory. Well, that's one area that I would suggest that I slightly disagree with you. Well, I mean, I agree with the underlying aspect of it is you definitely want it in the private sector rather than state imposed, right? That blanket, full-on collectivist imposition on everybody. The problem is these corporations in the modern world have a very, very cozy relationship, and a lot of them are economically propped up by big government, which means taxpayers are the ones who are forced to sustain them. So should they really have that much power when in reality their entire business would most likely cease to exist without forcing taxpayers to prop them up? I'd say they're in a position to not even attempt to bully their employers or the customers because their employees and customers are also taxpayers. Keep that in mind, folks. Bowman says he believes it's likely the necessary number of Canadians will get the shot or shots to protect themselves and others and allow for a return to normal life. Employers do have an obligation to keep workplaces health and safe. It's very unlikely that an employer would have grounds to terminate an employee based on the refusal to get a COVID-19 vaccine currently, wrote Ouellette. However, if a COVID-19 vaccine was readily available and an employee refused to get the vaccine, the employer could potentially require the employee to be removed from the workplace until the COVID-19 pandemic is contained. That's a bit of a gray area as well. So once again, this is just a speculative opinion, even if it is coming from a so-called expert that has so far not been tested. Some countries already require travelers to have certain vaccines as a condition of entry. The CEO of Australian airline Qantas said passengers will have to provide proof of COVID-19 vaccination. Well, there's a big difference between a country and an airline, right? So let's try to keep that stuff clarified. Airline employees would be a gray area, one of many vaccine-related employment cases that Franco predicts could end up being fought in court. It's going to be very interesting to see how it all unravels in the courts and in the court of public opinion. With files from Shannon Patterson. Yeah, it's not just the courts, but yeah, it's that court of public opinion. Because at the end of the day, folks, if you are willing to take and assume that power of your sovereignty of your inherent inalienable rights and freedoms is nobody can force you to do anything. The power ultimately is in your hands, at your disposal, if you're willing to use it. Anyways, I'll place a link to this article in the description of the video below. And like I say, use this to push back against those who are suggesting or insinuating that whether it's big government or these corporations can just go around forcing you to get a vaccine. Because according to these experts, that's not the case. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.